Alright, so there's a few ways to go about mesh binding inside Blender. By mesh binding, I mean having the armature deform the mesh, alright, or the object that you want it to deform. Now, to help me demonstrate this, I've created a very simple scene, and if you'd like to follow along, simply open the supporting files 06 mesh binding start.blend, and you'll be presented with this armature, and also a few hidden objects that we're going to go through. Alright, so the armature itself is at its raw state. If you look at the viewport display here, everything is checked off, so you can see the true colors of the bone. Now, it's set to B bones, because those are my favorite bones. Alright, so the top bone is green because it has a constraint assigned to it. And as you can see here, it's a limit rotation constraint. And that's to limit the rotation in the x-axis of 90 degree each ways. Alright, so if I rotate this, it's 90 degree on each ways. I simply press R and rotated that, and you should see that in the screencast keys here. You'll also notice that with this bone selected, a few of the locks are actually on to prevent me from rotating or moving them in the wrong direction. So I only have the X and the W for the quaternion, and if you're set to earlier, simply keep the X on lock. That's really up to you. Now, more on quaternion versus earlier later on in the course. Now, and also more on the constraint later in the course. So that's not the focus of this. All right, so we're going to put in front on, and also I have shapes already assigned to these bones as well as group colors. All right, so basically bone groups are defined here by adding groups and assigning colors to them and assigning selected bones to them. More on that later in the course. And then we also have the actual viewport display of the bone. Here you can add a custom object that you model in order to represent that bone. More also on that later on in the course. Now, this is the armature that we're going to work with. And so what we want to do is we want to make a hinge joint. Now, we do have a few objects here. We have a tube that we're going to use more as an organic object with vertex group as well as weight painting, but we're not going to start with this one. We also have a one mesh hinge joint that has a few modifiers on it, as well as a nice bevel. So it looks good. And then you could use that as a game example, if you will. And you will notice that the parts are actually not welded. All right. They are one mesh, but they're not actually merged with one another. So they have a freedom of movement. It's something that is really, really important when you're actually binding a mesh to an armature. All right. So we also have a very complex hinge joint that was created by 80, which looks awesome, and it's comprised of a bunch of little parts. Now, you might think that this is going to be the hardest one to actually bind to this, but that couldn't be further away from the truth, simply because there's no easier way than to just select the objects and parent them to the actual bone, especially for something like this, all right? Now, there's one thing that you do have to take in consideration before doing so, and it's that your transforms are actually applied. So all your locations are zeros, all your rotations are zeros, and all your scales are 1. Now, we do not worry about the dimension simply because this is the bounding box of each object in the space. All right, so it has nothing to do with the scale of the object in terms of object scales, right? So if you do not have that, and that your pivot points are not at the same place than the actual armature, then you should simply select all the objects and then shift select the other ones. And if you've selected the armature and cannot select the objects, simply go under edit and then turn off lock object modes. That actually prevent, if it's on, from going away from the object mode. So you won't be able to go back and forth from pose mode to object mode of objects and such. All right, so just keep that in mind. All right, with everything selected, simply go to Object, Apply, All Transform, or use the shortcut key Control A. Control A, All Transform. And that will reset all the transform of your objects where they are in the world. And they will make sure that your pivot points are also at the dead center of the scene, where it's also the pivot point of the armature. Now, this is to ensure that if you export that both object will end up at the same position in space. If you do not do that, you might end up with the parts at the wrong place, and that will actually break the rig, and you do not want that to happen. All right, so now that we have that done, we simply select all of the objects that we want assigned to one of the bone. We shift select the bone, again, by having lock object modes off, because otherwise you wouldn't be able to do enter object in different modes selection. Right, so you do that and you press Ctrl P, and then from there we have quite a few options. If you choose object or object keep transform or without inverse and so on, that will actually only parent it to the armature object itself and not to the bone. Armature deforms is when you're using an actual modifier that is an armature modifier, and then you're using vertex group to actually assign the weight. And then we have bones, which is the one that we're going to use now to actually parent directly the object to the bone. And relative, I'm not too sure. I've never really seen the difference between the two of them, so I just use bones. And in most cases, I've never had troubles with it. So, just use bones. And all right, so let's click on bone. All right, so now if I select this, as you can see, now it follows the bone, but the rest doesn't. So now we need to do the same thing with the rest of the object. So if I select the actual cylinder here and the base object, and I shift select the other bone and press Ctrl P and select bone, then I should be able to do this. All right, it actually works now. It's all there. It's all parented to the rightful bone. And if you take a look here, if I select the object, make sure to go here. If you take a look at the relationship, you'll notice that these objects are directly parented to the actual bones. And same with this one, it shows the arm bone. All right, so that's that. So now let's take a look at the other example that I have that is a little bit different in terms of workflow. Now in this simple joint, what we need to do, because it's one object, we need to add a modifier. So if we go to the modifier panel and we go here and add an armature modifier, we actually need to bring it all the way to the top of the modifier stack. Simply because it's best to actually edit the armature at a lower vertex count, because it's easier to assign vertex group that way. And it's also, a lot faster. So if you select the little picker here, you can actually go and select the armature directly. Right, and it already has the vertex group checked, and we can always use preserve volume, but on something like this won't actually make any difference. All right, just keep that in mind. We'll show what that does in a bit. All right, so let's actually go to the object data property panel here, and in the vertex group, let's actually create two vertex group. All right, we need a vertex group for each of the bone that we want to actually separate this object into. All right, so we've got two bone. One of the bone is called arm in small letters, as well as the other one, which is called forearm in small letters as well. So all we need to do is to select the object, go into edit mode, select the vertices that we want for the forearm, press Ctrl plus a few times until all that part of the object which is not welded to the other is selected. And then from there, let's select the top group here and call it forearm in small letters, and then assign a weight of 1. Right? So now, alternatively, we want the bottom parts to be affected by the arm, so we simply need to call this one arm. Right? So rename the second group arm. Then from there, you could select each of the vertices and shift select that one and press Ctrl plus a few times. But in this case, we can actually just press Ctrl I and invert the selection. All right, so let's assign that to the arm bone with a weight of 1. All right, so now if I tab out of edit mode and select the actual armature, now it's moving and it's already bound to the rig. Now that's the easiest way to go about it when you're actually binding this type of object for a game. So it's one object. It's a lot faster to do it by assigning the vertex group as opposed to painting it for something this complex.